All right, hello everybody. Today, like I mentioned, I'm going to be talking a little bit about a book called, well, the Chinese, uh, the direct translation of the title would be the Water Margin Story or Water Margin Novel. Uh, I'm just gonna let you know I'm going to butcher every single Chinese word in this thing because not only have I always had problems figuring out how to pronounce the Chinese based on romanization, but now I've got Wade Giles, and Pinion both in my head, both fighting for fighting for supremacy. And this particular book was written. This particular translation of the book was written before Pinion existed. So, I it would be way too much research to to figure out how to pronounce all of this. But the book we're talking about today is called Hu Chuan or something like that. And again, water margin novel. And this book is one that was translated multiple times into many different languages. A classic Chinese novel written sometime probably in the 1300s. The primary author is a guy named Shi Naian, who lived, we believe, from 1296 to about 1372. But the first time that this book was discussed, as far as I've been able to find, the first time this book was discussed by like a contemporary Chinese source is back in 1524. And then there's the fact that there's multiple different versions of this book. There's a 70 chapter version, which at least the translator of this version, Pearl Buck, believes that those 70 chapters were all written by the same guy. But then there's additional versions with 100 chapters, 115 chapters, 120 chapters. And it's not certain whether those chapters were the writings of Shi Naian or whether they were added by someone else. And there's even been some questions raised as to the authorship of the book in the first place. Of course, one of the things that is important to note is that some of the stories in this book are retellings of stories that existed earlier in Chinese literature as well, often describing, often fancifully, the certain historical or pseudo-historical events. This book is set around 1120, and it's basically the story of 108 bandits that go up against the Chinese government of the time, which was, at least in the story, was incredibly corrupt and was basically parasitizing off of the people. This is not a review of the book, and it's not an in-depth look at the book's history, because I wouldn't say that I'm an expert in either. But, the historical value of this book is very high. It is, heralded as one of the great Chinese novels, despite its rather colorful content. Kind of held up alongside, the Three Kingdoms, or, well, I haven't heard it put next to Journey West, but I'm kind of doing that too, because these are all like fundamentally important Chinese works of fiction. Three Kingdoms and this are historical fiction in the sense that they use people that existed, events that happened, and kind of color them up a little bit. They're not. They're more. They're more Herodotus than Thucydides, I guess is the way to put it, right? Because Herodotus's histories were very fanciful and colorful, whereas Thucydides was a little bit more clinical and was trying to kind of stick to the facts. If you've read any of those histories as well, of like the ancient Greek and Mediterranean history. So this book is about 108 bandits. They get together to fight against the corrupt government, and putting it like that is giving it a lot more like focus than the book actually seems to have. Again, I haven't read it the whole way through in a long time. I read it back when I was in university in probably the 2010s, so it's been at least a decade since I've read the book in full, and this is how far I am of this version right now. I think I'm on chapter 12 or so of 70. This version that I'm familiar with is called All Men Are Brothers, because Pearl Buck says that the title is basically translatable, Water Margin Story. It's been given other titles such as The Marshes of Mount Liang, things like that. So Pearl Buck did this translation in 1933, and it was the first like commercially significant English translation of this particular book. Of course, the book had been translated into multiple other languages, French, Japanese, Thai, much earlier. But this was the first time this book came into America, or to English, the English language in general. Pearl Buck was the daughter of two missionaries and spent a good chunk of the early part of her life in China. She was a writer, and she actually got the Nobel Prize for Literature back in, probably I forgot the year, but suffice it to say, she's a well-known figure in literature and in, fluentness in Chinese and in understanding Chinese literature. And she herself says in her preface for this book that she tried to translate it as literally as possible because of her love for just the way that the things that are in this book are phrased. So there was another translation around 1937 by J.H. Jackson. That's a version of the book that a lot of people have talked about in my kind of not over the top, but like top level examination of different translations. And it's also worth noting that there is a translation in English of the whole 120 chapter version, authorship not with, questionable authorship of the 120 chapter version notwithstanding. That one is called The Marshes of Mount Liang, and it is translated by Alex and John Dent-Young. So I haven't read any of those translations. This translation is the one that I read at the university. They had this one in the library in 2 volumes. And, it's just one more quick translation note from the preface of Pearl Buck is that she said that she worked with a Mr. M.H. Lung and translated it sentence by sentence as literally as she could. And so what you'll find about this translation, and as I've made videos about translation in the past, the translation of this book by Pearl S. Buck is incredibly unidiomatic, which leads to some very memorable phrasing. And that's kind of what I want to focus on for the remainder of this video. Again, this is not a full review because I haven't read most of it for over a decade, but I do kind of want to draw attention to some of the fun that is in this book if you're able to stomach it. This is not a book for the faint of heart. So in reading Three Kingdoms, I noted to myself what a great deal of cavalierness or casualness there was about the deaths of individuals or even large groups of individuals. They throw away 10,000 or 50,000 men without really much of a send-off, and they have absolutely no concept of the conception of the phrase don't shoot the messenger, right? Three Kingdoms is a very violent book. However, compared to All Men Are Brothers, Three Kingdoms is a walk in a field of daisies, because while this book is not necessarily about the consignment of 100,000 men to death in one sentence, this book revels in gore and licentiousness and just mayhem, and that's one of the things that makes it such a simultaneously engaging yet bizarre read. It's unlike anything you've ever read in Western literature, probably. I mean, maybe someone in the comments will have this book is actually a lot like this book that perhaps I've never read from European literature, but All Men Are Brothers is a hell of a ride. And I can say that having read the whole thing 10 years ago without necessarily remembering some of the details, without remembering all of the plot details, but my God, some of the stuff that happens in this book is insane. It's also worth noting that this book was banned multiple times in China, usually when there was government unrest, because this book was seen as a way to encourage people to distrust the government more. Mao Zedong loved the book until he had power. So, without further ado, for the rest of the video, I'm just going to talk to you about some of my favorite quotes and elements of this book just from the first few chapters. I might, once I finish rereading this book, I might do a full video or even a series of videos on it because it's just so interesting and so much fun to read. But for now, let's just give you guys a little taste of the bizarre weirdness that you will get in this edition, especially in the Pearl S. Buck translation, which, as she said, attempted to be as literal as possible. And so, for instance, in the English language, talking any English-speaking country, you will never hear someone say, I ate bitterness. But in this book, it happens probably every 3 pages. Something horrible happens to someone, and in a metaphorical sense, he claims that he ate bitterness. There's all kinds of weird, like, non-idiomatic Chinese figures of speech that show up in the Pearl Buck translation that might not show up in one that was attempting to be closer to idiomatic English. And of course, this is one of the reasons why I like having access to a variety of different translations for a book. It is easier to immerse myself in a story sometimes, if it is told in more idiomatic English, right? As opposed to, and it depends, of course, what the source was and how colorful the original source was. But then at the same time, sometimes you just want to hear the way that writers wrote back in the day, right? In that language, what words they used, what figures of speech they had at the time. And this Pearl Buck translation is full of that, despite the fact that, at least according to an uncited statement on Wikipedia, that there's certainly some mistakes in this translation. Based on Pearl Buck's, preface or foreword or whatever it's called, she was a fluent speaker of Chinese, and she basically worked by having this M.H. Lung person read it to her, and then she would translate it as literally as she could, sentence by sentence. So the example that Wikipedia gives for a mistranslation is that a character has a nickname, the Flowery Monk, if translated correctly, but in this book, he's referred to as Priest Hua. And again, that's one of those points in the Wikipedia article that says citation needed. And so even though I tried to, even if I wanted to know who said that and whether it was true or not, I really can't tell you. Whenever you look at, short aside, whenever you look at Wikipedia, always look at those little numbers in brackets, because those are the actual sources. And people can often cite things without really understanding. It's a certain possibility for a person to cite something and look at it with a bias, or look at it without some kind of context that it needs. And so if you're going to use Wikipedia for research purposes, you want to go to those references and not to Wikipedia directly. Just a little aside there. Anyway, let's get back to the book. Okay, early on, you end up with these great idiomatic phrases in English, or Chinese idiomatic phrases that are not at all idiomatic in English. For instance, on page 7 of this version, there's a commander who goes to a temple to read an edict to these monks, and something happens that terrifies him. And this is how it is described in the book. Quote, "The commander was in such terror, his 3 souls floated from his body, and his 7 earthly spirits left him." Now, when I read this just recently, it was like one of those things where at the back of my head, there's kind of like a Rodney Dangerfield. It's like, I didn't even know I had that many, right? Like, it's wonderful language that is so vastly different from anything that you'll hear from an idiomatic English writer, that it just grips you, and you're like, oh, I need to see more of this. Moving on page 10, one of the things that you see in this book is something that you see in a lot of like epic literature, even in Western civilization, right? The Iliad or the Odyssey, they have a lot of these phrases that are used over and over again to punctuate a spot, to kind of like it's how epics work, right? Like there's a lot of common phrasing that's repeated over and over and over through the story. And the reason for that in Western literature is that a lot of these stories were originally told by oral tradition. And so you wanted to have something for the bard to come back to and say, and they lived happily ever after, right? It's an idiomatic phrase that gets repeated over and over again to kind of make sure that the person memorizing it is kind of staying on track. It's a way for them to return to the track if they kind of start to fall off. And so probably a couple of times a chapter, we get something like this. This particular example is, so this commander who was so scared just a moment ago is now asking for this door that is sealed that supposedly contains 108 devils, right? And he's asking for it to be opened. And, he's being very, what do you call it? Intransigent about it. He's not listening to the head priest. Is like, no, we're not supposed to open this. We were told never to ever open this. And a phrase that we get here that's going to be used with a lot of different characters throughout the book is, but how was the commander willing to hear him? Right? This is the start of a paragraph, and you might change out the commander for a bunch of different characters in the book. But you're going to hear, if you're reading this version especially, you're going to hear this phrasing over and over again. But how was X willing to hear him? The to eat bitterness thing is another example of that. Later on page 39, we have an example where the author is moving from one set of characters to another. And this is another phrase that shows up a lot. Quote, but the story must not be told in tiresome detail. Now, if you were writing in English, you would write this phrase once, and then if you had to write something similar again, the way that we write English today is that you would change it up. You'd say, I don't want to repeat myself over and over and over again. But this was a valid technique in more ancient writings that, we kind of have pushed ourselves away from in a stylistic sense, but it's very effective because you seeing something like this repeated verbatim, this phrase, but the story must not be told in tiresome detail, is the kind of thing that kind of returns you to the story a little bit whenever you see it, and it has that it has that effect. I don't know. It has some kind of a weird effect on me. I don't know if it does on you. Maybe it's only because I'm reading this particular story, but it's one of these things I notice where it's like this is repetitive, but it's repetitive to a purpose. Maybe that's what I'm trying to say. Another great quote comes from, and again, I'm only looking at like the first 6 or 7 chapters because I didn't want to make this a 1,000,000-year-long video either, because if I went through the parts that I've read recently, they take an hour. So, we're just in the first couple of chapters. Page 15, there's a guy who is being persecuted by a commander of a garrison, and he's basically he's terrified that he's going to be ruined by this guy. He goes home. He talks to his mother. His mother says this, quote, my son, to extricate yourself from a difficulty, there are 36 ways, but the best of them all is to run away. This is a phrase that, again, we will see multiple times throughout the book. It appears to be some kind of, idiomatic Chinese phrase or some kind of, reference to something that I have no idea what it's referring to, but it's very gripping in a sense. It's like, well, if you have a problem, there are 36... We all know, everybody knows, that there are 36 ways to deal with any given problem. But the best one is to run away. And it's like, well, wait, what are the other 35? I feel like if there was a clear best in all situations, then you wouldn't need the 36 different ways, right? You'd pick the correct one for the appropriate situation. But it's like, oh, the best one is always to just run away. It's like, well, okay. I kind of want to know what the other 35 are. There's other stuff like one of the things about writing it in non-idiomatic English, of doing a direct translation, is we end up with phrases like this. Then in the guest hall, a table was spread, and a servant brought a tray with 4 kinds of vegetables and a plate of cow's flesh, and set them forth, and he poured wine into cups. Not beef, cow's flesh. There's a lot of this in the book because of the way it was, because of the way that Pearl Buck wanted to translate it. Fair enough. I would probably have said beef instead of cow's flesh, but to each his own. Let's see. There's another... There's a great scene early on where this guy is running away, right? He's decided to run away from this guy who's persecuting him. He's headed to he stopped at a random like estate, a manor, and there's a man there who let him in and said, "Oh yeah, we'll keep you for the night, and you can have some food, and then you can go on your way in the next morning." Or I think he stays for a couple of days. But the point is, at some point, this man who was an instructor in the capital, an instructor of military arms, sees the man's son practicing with a staff, and he says, and he notes, kind of under his breath almost, that his son is made, that this young man is making mistakes in his forms, and the young man gets very angry about this, and the father is like, well, maybe there's something to it. Maybe you guys should, spar a little bit and see what happens, and then we'll go from there. So here we have, so what ends up happening is that they end up sparring, and Wang Qing, I'm going to butcher every Chinese name in this story, and I apologize for that. But he wins handily, and you expect him to, because he was an instructor in the capital. He's trained tens of thousands of men how to fight in an actual army, and he wins. But as soon as he wins, I wanted to quote this whole thing, so here we go. Quote, "But the old lord answered, 'It does not matter at all, though his feet and hands are broken off.'" That he's speaking of his son, where he's like, despite what danger my son goes into in this challenge, he's brought it upon himself by yelling at you for criticizing his form. "Though his feet and hands are broken off, he has but brought it on himself." "Ah, I have offended," replied Wang Qing. And then he went to the rack where weapons hung, and he took a fencing staff, and he went to the space of ground and stood in a posture. The young man saw this, and he took his staff and twirled it, and rushed toward Wang Qing. Wang Qing suddenly pulled his own staff back behind himself, and the young man, staff in hand, dashed on. Wang Qing turned and struck his staff to the earth. The youth saw it and lifted his staff in both hands, but Wang Qing did not strike him. He drew back his own staff and pointed it at the youth's breast, and withdrawing it quickly, he twirled it, and the youth's staff was knocked to one side, and the youth fell backward. At this, Wang Qing hastily dropped his own staff and hurried to the young man's side and lifted him, saying, "Do not blame me. Do not blame me." But the youth scrambled to his feet and went to one side and fetched a stool, and he pressed Wang Qing down upon it, and he touched his own head on the ground before him in obeisance, and he said, "I have passed uselessly through the hands of many teachers, and I have not a particle of ability. Sir, I can only beseech you to teach me." This is a great little, it's less than a full column of one page, but it's a really great little mini story, and there's a ton of this throughout the whole book, where someone will say something, someone gets offended, they'll spar a little bit, the person who wins, to show humility, will apologize. There's a great amount of really interesting cultural artifacts tucked away in this book, and it's just a real pleasure to read because of that. You get to see a completely different world from what we're used to and what we think of as common sense today. We have one of the things about this book is that it is incredibly gory. In addition to being incredibly violent, we also have these incredibly gory scenes. We have a lot of completely pointless human cannibalism, etc., etc., etc. Where Three Kingdoms was willing to kill 100,000 men in 4 words, this book kills 100,000 men. This book only kills 100 men, but it eats them. It's crazy. Early on, there's a guy named Lu Ta, and again, mispronouncing his name, but basically, there's a guy named Cheng the Pig Butcher, or Cheng the Butcher, who's bothering someone, and this man asks Lu Ta to make a fool of Butcher Cheng in order to get vengeance on him, right? And so Lu Ta comes to the idea of he works at a high level in the military. He goes to Butcher Cheng, and he does this great practical joke on him, which goes too far, but we'll get to that in a second. He basically says, "I need 10 caddies of lean meat cut into strips and no fat in it and no gristle in it at all." And, Butcher Cheng is like, sure, I can do that. I'll have my people do that. He's like, no, I want you to do it yourself. He's like, you know what, you're right. This humble one shall do it himself. So he cuts up 10 caddies. And by the way, I had to look this up, but a caddy is an ancient, not ancient, but an old Chinese unit that right now, or after like the 16th century, it was standardized to about 500 grams. But before that, and therefore when this book was set and written, it was probably closer to about 600 or 605 grams. So it's a little more than a pound. So 10, when he says 10 caddies, he means about 12 pounds. 12 pounds of lean meat, has the pig butcher himself cut it up, taking up his time and his efforts. Then he says, all right, I need 10 caddies of fat with no meat in it, and I need you to cut that in strips. And Cheng is like, well, that's idiotic. Why do you want that? And he's like, this is just what I was ordered, right? This is what I was told to get from you. Are you going to give it to me or not? And he's like, fine, I'll do it. So he gets 10 pounds of fat, and he chops up the fat into strips. all on his own time, right? 10 caddies, not 10 pounds. And then finally, Lu Ta is like, okay, now I need 10 caddies of gristle, and there must be no meat or fat in it, and I need that cut into strips. And Cheng is like, you're making fun of me, aren't you? And Lu Ta throws all the meat in his face and says, yes, I was. And so they fight. And then it's crazy because Lu Ta is an extremely strong person. Cheng is pretty strong too, but Lu Ta completely outclasses him. And there's this scene of basically Lu Ta hits him 3 times and kills him. And the scene, this is going to get a little bit colorful here, but I think it's worth reading. Let's see if I can find it. Okay, here we go. Lu Ta's first hit hits Cheng in the nose. And as he spoke, he lifted his fist, and with a dull thud, he hit Cheng on the bridge of the nose, and the fresh blood flowed out. Cheng's nose was broken and bent to the side, and of a sudden, he smelled as many smells as though he opened a condiment shop. Soybean sauce, salt, sour, sweet, hot. All in a second, he smelled them all. He tried to get up, but he could not. A little bit more goes on. Lu Ta hits him again, this time in the eye. And he lifted his great fist and hit Cheng on the eye socket and split open the corner of his eye, so that his eyeball burst out. It was now to Cheng as though he had opened a silk shop, wherein were silks of many colors, for he saw black and purple and red from the bursting of his eyeball. And this is one of the lighter scenes where they put gore into the book, or where Shi Naian puts gore into the book. It's not a book to be read by people with weak stomachs, for sure. But if you're willing to put forth the what would you call it, the Constitution to roll the mind checks, the Constitution and mind checks to go through this book, I'd say it's definitely worth it, because it still is a classic. It's not. When I was looking through different books that have been based on this, there's all kinds of crazy stuff that was based on this, including, of course, the Sui Koden series, the Sui Koden series of video games. But that's another story. So Lu Ta basically kills this Cheng guy, and it totally was not justified. Like everybody's like, yeah, you're going to go to jail at best, and they're probably going to execute you. And so what happens is that Lu Ta gets a letter and he basically runs away, and he gets a letter and goes to a temple, and the guy that gave him the letter is like, this guy's going to become a priest, and it's interesting because the characters in this book are very like hot and cold about like their word about things sometimes. So Lu Ta is getting this letter to go be a priest, and he says, and the book says, Lu Ta meditated a while in his heart, and he said to himself, if I go away now, where shall I go and to whom? This road is best after all. So he said aloud, if the merciful one so helps me, I am willing to be a priest. I can only trust you to help me. Thus it was decided. He sounds very sincere. The problem is that he is very used to his kind of rough around the edges soldier's life, and so despite coming in and agreeing to follow the rules of the temple, he does not follow the rules of the temple. Every couple of weeks, he gets very hungry and he wants some wine, and so he goes to the village and he tries to basically get meat and wine from the people there, including like he goes to a shop and the guy's like, well, I don't have any cow's meat. All I have is dog meat. He's like, I don't care. I'll just whatever meat you got, I'll take it. He's like, I'm tired of all this vegetarian stuff at the temple. And the guy's like, wait, you're from the temple? Oh no, right? Because everybody at the village at the foot of the mountain that the temple's at basically is in debt to the temple, and so they're like, oh no, I just fed you meat and wine. They're gonna kill me. They're gonna take my home away. And so he's completely. Lu Ta has changed his name to Lu Qixien, I believe, and he's like, oh yeah, no, I'm totally not from the temple. Give me the food, give me the wine, and then he eats and drinks. And he's like, "Oh, by the way, I'm from the temple. Come get the payment there." And it's like, he wakes up in the middle of the night and he has to go to the bathroom, so he just goes behind the Buddha statue. It's really ridiculous how he sounds so sincere. At this one point, he was, "Yes, I shall do this. My honored sir, whatever you believe is best." And then he's like, "I can't keep this up." He goes around. He goes to a blacksmith and he's like, I want so he's doing all these non-priest like things, and he's a warrior at heart, and so he goes to a blacksmith and he says, I want a staff weighing 100 caddies, which would be about 120 pounds, between 100 and 120 pounds, a staff of iron. And the blacksmith's like, first off, I can't believe you're gonna try to use a staff that heavy. Second off, I don't think I could make a staff that heavy. And third off, aren't you from the mountain temple? You shouldn't be here. Isn't that a dog leg in your robe, in the fold of your robe, kind of thing? And so they get into this argument. The guy's like, I can make you a staff weighing 81 caddies, maybe. And so he settles for that. It's just an incredibly it's a fascinating book, and it's one of those books where I probably will go and read the first off, I probably will go read the J.H. Jackson version at some point. That one was published in 1937 and is heralded as a little bit more like, I don't know, better by some people. The interesting thing about the longer versions is that this book is a book about rebellion. And of course, rebellion is one of the things that Chinese governments throughout centuries have been kind of loath to support. And so there's at least some thoughts that the original 70 chapters was the story, and then the extra between 30 to 50 chapters that were added to make the 100, 120, somewhere in between versions, were added by someone else in order to turn the book from a book about rebellion into a book about rebellion and then redemption back into the system. And so, I'm actually curious about those extra 50 chapters and what actually happens in them. But it's important when reading them to, if you decide to go read them, to go and be a little bit skeptical about their applicability to the previous 70. But that's, I don't know. That's all I've got prepared for you guys today. I'm gonna continue reading this, and maybe I'll do a little bit more in-depth videos about it occasionally here and there. It's one of those things kind of way on my back burner, so it's not going to be super regular or anything like that. But if you enjoyed this, you probably should expect to see another video about this or two in the next couple of months, maybe. We'll see. Yeah, All Men Are Brothers, aka Water Margin Novel, aka Shui Hu Zhuan, aka Marshes of Mount Liang, classic Chinese novel, extremely vivid, gory, licentious. The Pearl Buck translation is incredibly non-idiomatic, which makes it kind of extra fun in a lot of ways. And that's what I wanted to do for today. And I hope you have a good day. I don't know that I have anything prepared for tomorrow, being Friday, so I'll just say have a good weekend. I might come up with something for tomorrow. I don't know, but I hope you enjoyed this, brief, very top level, like surface level look at this book and the fact that it is such, and its classicness and its bizarreness, for at least from a modern perspective. If you go and I'll put some links in the description. I don't know if you want to go pick up a copy of this or whatever. Feel free. I believe there are copies over on like Archive. So if you don't want to spend any money, if you just want to like take a look at this for free, there are ways to do that too, because this was written in 33 and then re-copyrighted in 37, and so it might not even be under copyright. It might still be under copyright, but it might be one of those things you can borrow, or who knows. Anyway, that's all I got for today. Have a good day. Probably have a good weekend, and I'll see you next time for God knows what. See you all later.